I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. This week, for the Thanksgiving holiday, we bring you the history and politics of the labor movement in Montgomery County and somewhat more broadly in the region. I talk with veteran journalist Louis Peck, who has covered labor for more than a decade and followed labor for much longer. I also talk with David Rodich, former executive director of SEIU Local 500, known in Montgomery County as the MCPS Staff Union. Rodich talks about how SEIU 500 organized adjunct faculty in the Washington, D.C. region, including at Montgomery College, which, if you think about the losses the labor movement has taken for decades, is a giant step in labor organizing.
An excuse for the pratfall. We won't be bothered with the meaning of it all. We don't expect too much today, never get it anyway. It's getting harder to believe a single word these people say. You gotta give 'cause life's a tale. How to compromise a lifeless ordinary.
If you are new to the show, I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. It is my hope that this podcast will help those who feel left out reconnect in our local communities. Music for this episode comes from the Treading Lemmings, a Rockville-based Brit-pop band in the genre of the Smiths. Their music is available at Reverb Nation. It's Thanksgiving Friday, and I hope you're stuffed, above all with love and friendship, and ready for a Thanksgiving story about those who keep our society functioning. Indeed, those who have kept our society functioning the last 20 months through the pandemic. The frontline grocery workers, healthcare staff, cleaners and janitors, teachers and other educators, bus and train drivers, delivery workers. Since the 1970s, unions, which brought millions of American workers into the middle class, have been losing members and their place in society. The stories that Lou Peck and David Rodich tell is not so much about the romance of organizing, but the hard realities of union work. In Montgomery County, a burning issue is the vaccination mandate for county and school employees. While the teachers' union has welcomed a vaccine mandate, the county employees union, called McGeo, does not want a mandate. The issue has come to a head at the Maryland National Parks and Planning Commission, where McGeo says unvaccinated employees are being separated from vaccinated employees and grouped together and given different work. The police and firefighters unions also oppose any vaccine mandate. County Executive Mark Elrich has resisted calls for vaccine mandates, but you will see this is just the tip of the iceberg in labor politics. On a programming note, and in appreciation for all the hard work nonprofits do, we at I Hate Politics are inviting DMV area nonprofits to make a free solicitation pitch to our audience during the giving season. If you are interested, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com. And before we go to the story of labor politics in Montgomery County and the DMV, we got a little thanks as well this week.
Hey Sunil, this is Yannick Dechu. I grew up in Montgomery County, but live in Ottawa, Canada now, but still tune into your show every week to stay on top of the latest local news, and really appreciate that your show gives granular insights from a diversity of voices. So just wanted to say thanks for that, and keep up the great work. Shout out to you and your team.
Lou Peck, welcome to Our Head Politics.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Lou, you've been watching the labor movement in the Washington, D.C. region for quite some time, and particularly so in Montgomery County. Could you give us a sense of how the union movement and the politics of labor have evolved?
There are really two sort of major strands that I would start with here, and they are intertwined, and that is the county unions and the school unions. There are actually three unions that cover county government employees, and if you will, the major player and the most visible player has been the what is now today United Food and Commercial Workers Local 1994, McGEO, the president of which is Gino Wren, who is sort of a force of nature. I was reflecting yesterday that there have been 7 county executives in Montgomery County since the current former charter government started in 1970. Gino has been there for 6 of them. So in other words, he's outlasted 5 of them. County executives come and go, and Gino is still there. I should mention, besides Gino, there are 2 other county government employee unions, the Fraternal Order of Police Lodge 35 and the International Association of Firefighters. I believe they're Local 1664. Combined, they have probably about, I would say, 2,400 members. Gino's union has about 5,300 full-time employees and another 1,100 seasonal employees. The other side is school unions, which are there, again, 3 of them, a small one representing the administrators, a large one that represents the support staff, but again, front and center, and the big player there has for years been the Montgomery County Education Association, which represents somewhere between 13 and 14,000 teachers and supervisory personnel who work in the Montgomery County schools. Way back in the late 60s, at a time of labor strife in schools nationwide, there were teacher strikes in both Baltimore and Montgomery County. Out of this came a law from the state legislature that, while it was punitive in the sense that it said going forward, if you are a union, you strike, you're decertified as that union. It did, however, give unions collective bargaining rights in terms of the schools. So since then, the MCEA has had collective bargaining rights. For a couple of decades, it was the usual kind of adversarial labor management relationship that we think of when we think of labor. But that started to change dramatically in the late 80s and early 90s, in part with the election of a guy named Mark Simon, a history, social studies teacher. I think he was at Bethesda Chevy Chase, became president of the union. And what he did during his tenure was to embrace a model that at that time was very rare for school unions to embrace. And that was support of so-called peer assessment and review, known as PAR. The union accomplished by embracing that was to portray itself as something beyond simply a union that was interested in the well-being of its members and how big a paycheck they were going to have, and was able to more project the fact that the union was concerned about the schools holistically and the entire system and the achievement of the students. That brings MCEA into a period that was one of collaboration with the school administration that lasted for the better part of a couple of decades. That collaboration, for a number of reasons, has started to break apart in recent years. And what you have is a somewhat of a return in recent years to the old adversarial model between the school system and the MCEA. On the county side, collective bargaining really probably dates back to about 40 years to 1980, when the voters in a referendum gave the police the right to collectively bargain. That prompted pressure on the part of other workers for the county government to want the same kind of rights. In the meantime, Gino Wren, whom I mentioned earlier, was a sheriff's deputy who was elected the head of a association within the sheriff's department that represented the deputy sheriffs. And he and several other groups from the recreation department, some of the nurses who worked for the county, the librarians, all felt that they wanted more clout as far as bargaining with the county. And so they managed eventually to take over the county organization of employees organization, which was known as MCGO, short for Municipal County Government Employees Organization. And they eventually, in 1984, there was another referendum that gave county employees beyond the police the right to collectively bargain. And so MCGO became the bargaining unit for a large number of county government employees. Sort of a little bit of interesting history here, because once they took over MCGO and won the right to collectively bargain, there was a feeling that on the part of Gino and others who ran MCGO that they really needed to be part of a union, and they allied themselves, sort of an odd marriage, if you will. They allied themselves with the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 400 in the Washington area, which, as some of your listeners may know, represents most of the supermarket workers. It's a large union. I think it's about 40,000 members. There were tensions between the bargaining unit of MCGO, headed by Gino Wren, and the head of the Local 400. And eventually, the bargaining unit for Montgomery County broke away from the supermarket union, and in 1993 created what is today UFCW Local 1994 MCGO, and that's the union that Gino Wren continues to run.
Can you speak to how the unions worked together or did not?
Right after MCGO Local 1994 won the right to bargain on behalf of county employees in the late 1980s, a group formed that was with the acronym MCPEC, Montgomery County Public Employee Coalition. And it was actually formally incorporated, I think, with bylaws and officers. And it was basically an effort by all 6 county unions to coordinate so that the county government and the school system couldn't play them off against each other. MCPEC lasted, by all accounts, thrived until probably the Great Recession, and it blew apart because of a couple of reasons. One had to do with the so-called Maintenance of Effort, MOE law. It was passed in Annapolis prior to 2012, but it was strengthened in 2012 to put some more teeth into it. And what it basically said is that in the school system, you cannot spend less than you did the year before on a per pupil kind of basis. There was no such protection, if you will, for county employees. And so some of the county employee unions saw the MOE law as basically taking money from money that could go into their contracts and sending it to the school system. So that created tensions. More immediately, what I think blew apart MCPEC was in the wake of the Great Recessions. There were not only salary freezes and raise freezes, there were also furloughs. And in the school system, the teachers were able to negotiate to handle the savings that needed to be made without furloughs where the county government employees were furloughed. The county government at the time, through use of financial leverage, tried to force the school system to furlough some of the teachers in the same way that county government employees are being furloughed. The then superintendent of schools, Jerry Wiest, resisted that. The fact that there were furloughs for county government employees that weren't for school system employees created a lot of bad will, and that I think that broke things apart in the last couple of years. Gino Wren has been making a major effort, as he puts it, to bring the band back together.
What do you think are the key challenges on both strands, on the school side and the county side?
This is, going to be a huge issue in the coming county executives race. It's been an issue on and off for the last 30 years, and that is the question as to what degree the county embraces economic development, because obviously with economic development comes tax revenue. One of the things that has happened in recent years, and this is since Mark Elrich was elected county executive, and he was elected county executive with a very strong support of McGeo. The MCEA ultimately endorsed him, but endorsed him fairly late in the primary that he won very narrowly over David Blair in 2018. But what he and the unions have set out to do, it was to restructure county government. The thought from the unions is that they are going to have more say in, the shape of their jobs and how they do their jobs and the quality of the workplace. The thought from the county government is that by restructuring the county government, you can get some savings.
Did anything come off that restructuring impetus?
They set up some task forces involving, management and unions to try to collaborate in terms of what this restructuring would look like in some of the departments. I'm told that they brought in a consultant, and that there's a blueprint sitting there of ways to move ahead on this. And of course, and so far you haven't seen much or any evidence of things moving ahead. Recent interview I did with him, Gino Wren expressed some of the same frustrations that this initiative has not moved more quickly. You talk to Mark Elrich, he will say, part of the issue has been the fact that COVID had everybody working remotely, and part of trying to move this ahead involves people being in the same room and collaborating and finding new ways to collaborate, and that's hard to do when you have people working from home.
This is interesting. So yes, the plan didn't go forward, but McGeo and the bargaining unit got a raise. County executive did give them a raise.
The county executive gave them a raise, but the council said no in both 2019 and 2020. Ultimately, he gave them a COVID hazard pay package that was very generous compared to what was given by other municipalities in the state and the state government.
What are the chances that they will actually be able to pull off a countywide labor coalition?
I get the sense, based on some recent conversations, that Gino and his union would very much like to reconstruct something similar to what McPeck was in the 1990s and 2000s at the same time.
But what are the others saying?
I'm hesitating here because my understanding is that the discussions are still in a fairly early stage, and I'm, based on what I can see, while there have been some very preliminary, if you will, sharing of information and consultation on, say, political endorsements, I think is a first step. Gino would like to see if they can't be more collaborative on political endorsements in the coming election. Unlike Gino, who's been around for 40 years, keep in mind that the MCA has a new president, Jennifer Martin, who just came into office in the last few months. I believe that the head of the other big school union, the SEIU Local 500, Pia Morrison, I'm not sure how long she's been around, but I think it's relatively new.
Do you think there are any internal contradictions within McGeo, particularly between the police union and other employees who are probably more sympathetic to social justice and racial justice issues?
I have not witnessed evidence so far of those kind of fractures. And I think it's also important to note, which may militate against that kind of fracture, is that while yes, the FOP Lodge 35 is its own union. It represents the Montgomery County Police. McGeo's members include both the sheriff's deputies as well as the corrections officers in the county jail. So there is a fairly significant, if you will, law enforcement component to McGeo. So I think that.
Have you looked internally at either MCEA or SEIU Local 500, and have you seen their memberships grow? What how are they organizing, reorganizing? What are they doing?
Let me talk about MCEA. I'm not as familiar with SEIU Local 500. As MCEA, as I mentioned in the 1990s, going to the 2000s, managed to expand its appeal as a result of the peer assessment and review process, and be seen more as a union that was concerned with the whole school system and not just the economic well-being of its members. That in turn helped to strengthen its political clout. And that gets us to the whole issue of the Apple ballot, which we probably should talk about for a few minutes. The Apple ballot, once upon a time, was considered to have a tremendous amount of clout. And I think even today, if you ask candidates as to what are the two most desirable endorsements in a county down ballot race where voters may not be paying a lot of attention, it's going to be the Washington Post and the Apple ballot. The challenge for MCEA has been that clearly with COVID and the increasing move towards mail voting, early voting, which is going to obviously outlast COVID, is that in the old days you had hundreds of teachers out there on election day, when most people voted on election day, passing out the Apple ballots, trying to get the Apple ballot to people who may be using a drop box or early voting by mail through absentee. It becomes much more of a challenge. In terms of the tensions, in terms of MCEA, in the 1990s and early 2000s, you had a period of almost unprecedented collaboration between the union and the school system. And this was largely the work of Jerry Wiest, whom I mentioned earlier, who I believe became the superintendent of schools in 1999. Ironically, Wiest came out of a North Carolina system and was considered by the unions in North Carolina to be somewhat hostile to organized labor, came to Montgomery County, decided it was better to work with the unions and try to butt heads with them. So you ended up with a series of MCEA presidents and other MCEA officials, the executive director. Since the MCEA presidency changes every 3 to 6 years, the executive director of the MCEA is a longer-term position. One person I should mention, Tom Israel, had that job for 27 years and was in and of himself, while not well known to the average voter, very influential in a lot of what we're talking about. So you had a series of MCEA presidents and directors who were sitting in the room when these decisions were made. That started to break down after Wiest left the system in 2011 for a couple of reasons. I think the next couple of superintendents were not as collaborative as Wiest for a variety of reasons. Josh Starr had a fairly short tenure. In the case of Jack Smith, he had come out of a experience, I think the largest school system he had ever headed before Montgomery was Calvert County. I don't think he was used to dealing with the kind of structures like you have with the MCEA, and I think his mode of governments tend to be more top-down than you might have had in previous years. On top of that, I think that there was also there were a series of MCEA presidents who embraced collaboration with the school system. When Chris Lloyd became MCEA president in 2015, I think you had a rethinking of this in terms of by some of the top ranks of MCEA, they really began to wonder whether it was sort of healthy for the union to be dependent upon a relationship between a handful of officers at the top of the union and the superintendent, as opposed to having the rank and file membership being able to have more of a voice and more clout. And I think that's where things became a bit somewhat more adversarial. The culmination of that was that the three school unions for a number of years, I believe, going back to the first decade of the 2000s, as part of their cooperation, had decided to bargain jointly with the school board. MCEA decided, I think, as part of their, if you will, transformation of recent years, to break off and not do that joint bargaining in the last couple of years. And I think now there is a debate going on within the MCEA, and I think there is some sentiment with a new president of wanting to return to a more collaborative kind of model that you might have had in previous years. There is a new superintendent now that Jack Smith has left, who I believe is still an acting superintendent. I think that there have been some early tensions with her, and so the jury is still out in terms of whether MCEA stays on the more adversarial model of relationship with the school administration it's had in recent years, or it goes back to the somewhat more collaborative model, similar to what you had throughout the 1990s and the bulk of the decades of the 2000s.
Let me ask you a larger question. How have Montgomery County unions fared in comparison to the national trend in unions and labor movement?
Whatever the travails the unions have had in the last decade for reasons of money and other issues, I think the unions are far more of a force here and have done a lot better here than they have nationwide. And the simple conventional answer is Montgomery County is not the country. This is a county right now that is 4-to-1 Democratic registration. It has a population that is a significant portion of whom are government workers, perhaps not as much as once, but still very significant. A lot of these people work in Washington who themselves are members of unions, or are therefore going to take a friendlier view towards unions. That being said, I think that there is probably some element within the county, and I think you saw this come out in the pandemic when the unions were given another fairly hefty raise that was rejected by the council. You had several council members come out and say, look, there are people who have lost their jobs, who worry about losing their homes, putting aside the threat of illness under COVID. And here we are giving these munificent raises to county workers. So even in Montgomery County, you've seen a certain amount of that. I think the kind of resentment you may have seen nationwide, where people look at unions and sort of say, gee, I'm not doing as well as some of them. Why them and not me? And this gets to another issue of sort of the union's longer-term clout. They were successful after 12 years of Ike Leggett. His last term and the latter portion of his second term, his relationship with the unions went very scratchy. So the unions in 2018, particularly when I say the unions in this case, particularly McGeo, went full square behind Mark Elridge. It's interesting. Mark, for years, was a member of the MCEA because he taught elementary school in Tacoma Park. What's interesting is that while McGeo embraced him immediately, there was more of a debate within MCEA. He ultimately got the MCEA endorsement, but because the MCEA requires a supermajority, I believe, of 58% for their endorsement, it took a while for him to get the endorsement. By the time they endorsed him, it was just several weeks before the primary. But he was considered by the county government unions, particularly McGeo, to be a very good friend. So McGeo went all out, local 1994, to elect him. And, the critics basically say he turned around and rewarded them by giving them very large contracts. The flip side of that is that you look at the results of the 2018 election, while the local 1994 got its man, if you will, in the county executive's office, it was less successful in terms of its endorsements of the county council. I believe that three of 3 of the 9 members of the current county council were endorsed by McGeo, which again goes to the fact that if you sort of look back at trends in recent years, both with the school, with some of the school board elections and also the county council elections, MCEA and Local 1994 have not had the kind of clout in terms of being able to elect friendly bodies.
Lupek, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. I hope you'll keep watching as the band comes together or not, and I hope you'll come back.
I'm dreaming on the impossible dream, yet I really wouldn't want it any other way. 'Cause looking back,
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. In a moment, I'll be back with David Rodich, the former executive director of SEIU Local 500.
aging body with the spirit of you. Really could have made music with that girl from the Sundays, but she was already spoken for. Hypnotic Harriet as a whole to this.
David Rodich, welcome to I Hate Politics.
It's good to be with you this morning, Sunil.
One of the campaigns you're most proud of, you told me, was how you organized part-time faculty, adjuncts in the Washington, D.C. area.
That's absolutely right.
Tell me how you got started on that.
Well, the story begins, I think it was in 2003. I was interviewing for organizers, and this wonderful woman by the name of Anne McClare had interviewed with me for a position, and she came out of George Washington University, and she'd just been laid off by the United Auto Workers, who have been trying to organize the adjunct faculty at GW for a number of years, and gave up, basically. So I was very excited to hire her, but she put one caveat on the hire, which is you need to take a look at this industry, and you need to take a look at this particular school. And it was incredibly enlightening to me to know that conditions exist for a very, very large segment of the workforce that was right under our nose, but frankly invisible.
Okay, so conditions exist. Describe those conditions.
I'm going to do a point of contrast with what people traditionally think about as university faculty, right? Most people think of university faculty as these wise people that get these rare jobs, and they put in a certain number of years and they're offered tenure, and wow, you move forward. You do your teaching, you do your research, but you're full-time. The existence of an adjunct faculty member, or I like to use the term contingent faculty, is that they're hired for one purpose, and that's to teach a class. You're offered a certain fee, you agree to that fee, you teach that class, you show up, you teach, you go home. There's no benefits, there's no job security. There's really an experience that's very, very second class in terms of a university setting, because you don't have access to resources, to support, administrative support, even things as basic as access to on-site technology and copying and those kinds of things. You're really treated pretty much as a second-class outsider. And what we saw was a pattern that was developing over time, where increasingly this was the majority of, or a very large minority heading into a majority of the teaching that was going on in these schools. Why? Because it's a heck of a lot cheaper, right? You can, I'm not current in terms of what a full-time faculty whose tenure line might be making today, but I know for an adjunct faculty member, as an example, one of the first contracts we got was an agreement that amounted to a 20-25% increase for faculty at George Washington University that year just got them above $3,000 per course, right? Now, think of yourself as somebody who's gone through education, who's gotten your master's, a lot of cases gotten your PhD. Academia is a place that you want to be in, but there's no room in terms of tenure line. Why? Because the universities are increasingly, shifting over to this contingent teaching model. So that's your only path of entree. So you get these jobs that, again, will pay you a fee for a class, really be very, very minimal in terms of the support that they provide to you, no benefits, no job security. You have to reapply for your position every single semester, absent some of the work that the union did. And the most enlightening thing to me, and from a union leader perspective, this effort was an ongoing effort when SEIU intersected with it. In other words, we didn't have this aha moment where, oh my God, look at this workforce over here, we should go do something. This is a workforce that was already in motion. They were already trying to confront these kinds of issues. So what SEIU did was just to create this great alignment between movement that was already happening with the support and the resources that were necessary, essentially to strengthen faculty members to engage in this kind of a fight.
You were going into this after UAW had, and so clearly you would have had lessons drawn from what they did wrong and what we don't want to do wrong, right? That's part of it. And the second thing that I think that was very interesting that you mentioned is that you said the labor force here, I assume you mean the Washington, D.C. area, right, is different? Or do you mean just higher education, part-time faculty pool, contingent faculty pool? Is that different?
I think this is a national phenomenon. I think what's interesting about the Washington, D.C. area, and by the way, this is no different than areas like Boston and New York and some other areas where you have a significant concentration of colleges and universities within a fairly, limited defined geography, right? And so it became, what we discovered because of that was that there was a lot of community between schools. Right? I mean, these folks, shared a common set of challenges. The other thing that is interesting is that because you have contingent faculty who are trying to eke out a living, right? And most schools typically will limit you to one, maybe two classes of teaching as an adjunct faculty member. Well, what do you wind up doing? You wind up teaching at multiple schools, right? So the person that I'm talking to at GW also teaches at American University and also teaches at UDC. When I'm talking to them, they're talking about 3 schools. When you think about it, right, we always say to get a great job, you got to get a great education. Well, let me talk to you about maybe 5,000 of SEIU Local 500's members, not one of which has a degree below a master's. So maybe I'm teaching at 3 or 4 schools. If I'm really, really energetic about this, maybe I'm making $35,000, $40,000 a year, probably with $100,000 plus debt in terms of student loans. It's less about convincing people that the issues are real. It's more about, okay, so what's our theory of action about what we're going to do? How do we win here, right? How do we set standards? How do we, work with faculty members to understand that if you make this choice, if you make this move, can't guarantee success in the long term. We're working incrementally towards it. But at least you're going to be in the arena. At least you're not simply resigning to this fait accompli that, it's $3,500 per course for the rest of my life, and I'll do the best I can. No, I mean, faculty, contingent faculty make, as you know from your own experience, make a significant contribution to instruction, right? They're doing more and more. There's more and more expected of them. And here's the measure. Here's the frustration that I think about. When a student is sitting in a class, that experience for that student, whether they're being taught by a full-time faculty member or a contingent faculty member had better be a distinction without a difference. So I like to joke, there's no contingent faculty discount on your tuition, right? So contingent faculty are being held to the same standard in terms of instructional excellence and being paid at a fraction of what a full-time faculty member makes. And again, let me just anticipate the question that always comes up because we hear it nonstop. Wait a minute. Full-time faculty aren't just teaching. They're doing this, they're doing that. They have all these other responsibilities. Okay, fine. Let's disaggregate that stuff. What is it, 35% of their time is in other areas? Fine, let's pull that out. Let's just compare apples to apples, in terms of teaching responsibility. And by the way, that's a fairly easy measure to do because full-time faculty that teach during the summer typically are, guess what, being paid by the course, right? They're not. And if you just make a comparison between what they're getting during the summer and what a contingent faculty member gets just, on an ongoing basis, it's a fraction. And the obvious tension is what? It's that the universities don't want to say out loud what they honestly believe, right? Which is that, in our view, a well-rounded full-time faculty member gives a student a better experience than a contingent faculty member. Well, like I said before, what university would ever acknowledge that out loud, right? Because kids are paying an awful lot of money to be in these schools, and the expectation of the school is that they get a top-notch education no matter who's teaching the class.
That's quite a takedown of the higher education system we have, David. I want to ask you about any differences you saw between private schools, private universities, and public ones, because you did mention George Washington University to start and then American, but what was the difference or similarity or our public schools like University of Maryland, UMBC where I teach, are we different from the other private schools or is the same?
Right. If you're talking about the University of Maryland in this deep, deep, deep blue state, Sunil, you don't have the right to form a union. Right. It's that there is no collective bargaining in the university level in the public sector. But
just on the issue of contingent faculty, do private schools do worse than public schools, or public schools do worse than private schools? Do you see any distinction there?
Not a lot, not in the limited experience. I mean, I would draw one exception, and that's Montgomery College. Montgomery College, once we got past their initial foray into fighting unionization, in our experience, we won an election there and won it handily. They got very serious about the relationship, but it's the same issues, right? It's inaccessibility to resources. It's the kind of supports that contingents want for teaching. It's compensation. It's all those kinds of issues. And I don't see a lot of distinction between the public and private sector in terms of it. In my experience, most of the major private sector universities fought us tooth and nail. They lost, and in the end, they lost. So, we had really, with the exception of George Washington the first time, there was, once the union won the election and won it, decidedly, the schools got really, really serious about wanting to reach an agreement. And now, interestingly, a number of the schools have now begun to move in the direction of non-tenure line full-time faculty too. So what you're beginning to see, and to me, this is just a further erosion and threat to tenure and academic freedom and all those important issues, which are, that you could do a podcast alone on those, right? But, the reality is that in schools like American and Georgetown and a few others, they're just beginning to acknowledge the fact that there's this third rail now, right? You have tenure-line faculty, and you'll always have some of that, right? But a really, really limited amount. But increasingly, we're now seeing the presence of non-tenure-line full-time faculty also.
I think there are differences between universities in how much they are paid. And, the distinction you made was between what do you pay a regular faculty member for a summer course and what do you pay a part-time faculty member for a semester-long course. And that better be the same. And we do that, right? But there is a difference still between what, say, a Georgetown pays a part-time faculty member and what is, what we pay, or certainly what Montgomery College pays, right? Montgomery College is actually at the bottom of the ladder in that. Do you see that as a problem? And, how does that manifest?
Well, I think I'm comfortable in saying that I can't speak to an instance where we told people at the University of District of Columbia that the issue here is that they should be making what people at Georgetown make, right? Or a George Washington University where there's $1 billion endowment. So to me, the issue has never been, what is this adjunct making at this school in relation to that school? No, the issue to me is what is the relationship between, how does this individual school over here value their contingent faculty in relation to their full-time faculty? Do they value the instruction the same? The expectation is the same. I'll keep saying that over and over, right? We don't put an asterisk on somebody's diploma saying, Sunil did a great job. We're giving him his master's degree, but 30% of his courses were taught by adjunct faculty. So I got to put this as a asterisk. No, I'll give you a little analogy if I can to make this point, because I think it's an important one, right? If I'm an electrician, let's say, working for a company, right? And let's say, and I'm just making up a number, I don't know what the pay is, right? Currently, let's just say as a regular, accredited electrician, I'm making $75 an hour, right? There's no difference between the compensation level for the person working 40 hours a week to the person working 20 hours a week. The value of the work is the value of work. The only thing that distinguishes the compensation is what? The amount of time I spend doing it. In the academic world, it's as if that full-time electrician makes $75 an hour and the part-time electrician makes, $15 an hour.
Tell me what you were bringing to the table, quite aside from, the instructors themselves.
The whole campaign to establish a union. It's very, very difficult to do with volunteer resources alone. You really do have to have a lot of support. You have to have a lot of technology in terms of how you could communicate, right? How does all that get paid for? So you successfully win an election. Now you have to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement. Who's going to be doing that work? What does all that cost? How does that go? If there has to be a campaign to sort of help the employer, get into a better headspace in terms of settling, how do you do that? What's involved with that? What are the communication resources that you need? And then finally, when you get a union established and you have a collective bargaining agreement, there's representation issues. There's issues of contract enforcement, right? There's issues of provisions in that contract that wind up in binding arbitration to resolve a dispute. Well, that's all well and good, but if the average cost for an arbitration is $8,000 to $10,000, even split between an employer and the union institutionally, who's going to pay that money? From a group of people making $35,000, $40,000. So that's what I mean, that it's resources that just amplify what the faculty would otherwise be doing. It gives them the capacity. So you ask, okay, so what does the union get? What the union gets is just another group who's part of this bigger fight about affecting change. It's very rare in this work that unions have an opportunity to think, beyond just a single employer, and to think in terms of here's a massive industry, right? Here's an industry that has gone in such a bad direction. I mean, I never would have thought that teaching at a George Washington University was being part of the gig economy. Here we are, right? So the notion of being part of a fight that is eventually about, bringing greater security, bringing greater participation, eventually creating more full-time opportunity for contingent faculty so they don't have to run to 3 schools and teach 3 classes in 8 hours in 3 different locations. I mean, my God, how do you do that, right? You get off the red line and you dash into your classroom and boom, there you go. Where's your time? Where's your space? Where's your opportunity to meet with students? Right? This is a really, really significant issue in terms of something that really is industry-wide. And for me, from an institutional standpoint, it's a privilege to be part of this.
Let's talk about the system itself, which clearly you have described as broken. What advocacy, what tools do you have to fix the system itself?
Well, I think in increasingly, I think that there's issues around consumer awareness. I don't think a lot of people in the broader community understand what's going on here and what they're paying for, and what happens to that $55,000 a year that you're paying at GW a few years ago. I don't know what it is now. I'm paying these dollars, or I'm putting myself dramatically in debt, to pay these out. Yeah, some of it can get offset by some tuition relief, but generally not a lot. So where is my money going? How is my money being spent? How is it being invested? From the union's perspective, you heighten awareness that way. You also look at legislatively what could be possible, right?
What is possible?
Let me give you an example of an issue that we've done a lot of work on, right? Which is the issue of part-time faculty being eligible for unemployment insurance when they're not teaching. The schools would argue, but wait a minute, why should there be unemployment here? Because there's a, quote, reasonable expectation that you may be teaching. Well, maybe yes, maybe no, right? I don't, I have to apply for my job every semester. I won't know till I know whether I'm going to be teaching. In a lot of instances, these faculty members are finding out, 2 weeks before the class starts. Boom, you got this one, right? So I think heightening awareness, clearly making this an issue within the broader university community, I think has the potential to make a difference. Part of the challenge I see here is that even with tenure-line full-time faculty, the degree of influence that faculty members have over the life of the university, it's getting increasingly marginalized. I mean, what we used to call a faculty senate and its ability to impact university policy, and I know that's being increasingly minimized.
Just going back to this unemployment insurance issue, are there some state legislatures that are more receptive to that than others?
Again, I've been gone for a couple of years, so I'm not certain as to what the current status is. I know at the time I left, there was an awful lot of work that SEIU was doing both on a federal level and on a on a state and local level, depending on where unemployment is dealt with, to try and win on this issue. I would assume some progress has been made, but again, I don't know enough.
David Rodich, thank you for coming on I Hit Politics. Thank you for your work, and thank you for sharing your work with us. What lessons can we draw from my conversation with journalist Louis Peck and labor leader David Rodich? First, clearly the work of labor organizing remains a central part of our politics, notwithstanding the deep losses unions have taken over some decades now. As our economy has shifted, unions too have tried to move, organizing workers in areas where they were not unionized before, such as in higher education. In this context, I should mention the work of the Capital Area District of SEIU Local 32BJ, which has done incredible work organizing new immigrant workers in the lowest paying jobs, including as janitors and security personnel. Second, public sector unions appear to have held on to a stronger political position than private sector unions. But as private sector union membership and influence has suffered, regular folks have often come to look at public sector union members as privileged and have become resentful. As Lou Peck pointed out, even in deep blue Montgomery County, Maryland, unions are battling for public support, which is very different from political influence. Over the long term, public sector unions would benefit from supporting the expansion of private sector unions. Whether this happens, we will have to see. Third, it is also clear that while many unions are on the progressive side of politics, there are internal contradictions between unions and progressives more broadly. This is particularly visible when it comes to social and racial justice issues. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hit Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from the Treading Lemmings, a Rockville-based Britpop band in the genre of the Smiths. Their music is available on ReverbNation.com. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at IHPpod. I hope you will subscribe and share the episode as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. See you next time.
Do you remember the flowers in the vase? Gotta have the same colors on the day. For God's sake, if she gets this crazy by cake, what about the first mistake you made? Think you're looking at a pretty big mistake. And I know, yeah, no, said I do what I told. And no, said I would, but I insisting on wearing white.